Part 29. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn. I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 301. The ministers in the main hall were silent. Now the new master sitting on the dragon throne had a deep and unpredictable mind, and his methods were also vigorous and resolute. He had only been in power for 2 months, but he had already begun to amend the legal code, change taxes, hold imperial examinations, and develop water conservancy. He made drastic changes and the entire court was turned upside down. After going to court, Xie left the palace to pick up Shen Yu. After Emperor Yongning passed away, although Shen Yu looked fine and never shed tears, she was often in a low mood. Everyone she could regard as her confidant and best friend in this world was gone, and it was inevitable that she would feel depressed. Xie was worried and often sent her to chat with Yuan Kaiu. The carriage was driving on the street, and 11 Feng followed on horseback. "Your Majesty, the courtiers kneel down every day to ask you to ascend the throne and proclaim yourself emperor. Why do you keep refusing?" Almost everyone thought that Xie was heading for the position of the 9th Five Supreme Being, but when the road ahead was smooth and there was no obstacle, he stopped in front of the dragon chair. "I am willing to carry this mountain and river, but I don't want it to become as shackles for me." Xie looked at the people coming and going and said, "There are too many things that you cannot do when you are an emperor, and there are also many things that you must do that you are not willing to do." No one in the world understands him except Shen Yu. She has never asked him this question. The Shen mansion was newly renovated. The maid took off her garb and deliberately walked softly for fear of disturbing the master inside. "Are you still used to living here?" "Get used to it," Yuan Kaiu said with a smile. "How can I not get used to it?" Shen Yu teased the baby in the crib. The baby's mouth was open and saliva was drooling from the corner of its mouth. Yuan Kaiu used a handkerchief to lightly wet it with saliva. "It's starting to grow teeth, and I've been drooling a lot lately." "It's so cute." Shen Yu squeezed his chubby little hand and shook it gently, and said, "If it weren't for my physical inconvenience, I would have carried the coffin to send my father to reunite with my mother, and my brother could be at home with you and me." "Child, your brother is an older brother, and this is what he should do." Yuan Kaiu looked at Shen Yu's protruding belly and asked, "Is it 8 months old?" "No." Shen Yu put her hand on her belly, "It's only 7 months. Yuan Kaiu said in surprise, "Look at how big it is. It looks so good. I eat more." The child on the side said, "Aunt, Xianer eats the same amount as Aunt." "That's right." Shen Yu smiled and rubbed Li Xian's head. Li Xian is Li Zhaonian's only son. Before Li Zhaonian left, he sent away Queen Chu with a glass of poisonous wine, leaving only his only son Li Xian in his care and entrusted to Shen Yu, asking her to send the child far away. Shen Yu wanted to find a good family for the child, so Li Xian temporarily stayed in the palace and was taken care of by the original nanny. Later, Shen Yu found out that the nanny would not even spare a small child, beating and scolding her all day long, and the child would be eaten. Not full. Where can such a child be sent? Shen Yu didn't worry about giving it to anyone to raise, so Shen Yu kept Li Xian with her to raise him. She regarded Li Zhaonian as a confidant and asked Li to call her aunt. The maid knocked on the door and said that the prince had picked up the princess after going to court. Shen Yu stood up to say goodbye, walked out of the yard and put her hand in Xie Hu's palm. This year spring has started early, just after the new year, and the snow has begun to melt. Horse-drawn carriages were driving on the street, with people coming and going on both sides. Red New Year lanterns were hung at the doors of the shops on the street. Pedestrians who meet acquaintances will say Happy New Year to each other. Xie led Shen Yu on the quiet palace road. Deep and shallow footprints stretched into a line in the snow. They walked quietly, letting the wind fill their sleeves. This imperial city has witnessed the rise and fall of several dynasties. The winds of history have been blowing for thousands of years. Countless people have come and succeeded, just to keep the mountains and seas intact and the world to be peaceful. They walked in the long river of time, leaving behind one stroke after another in the history books. Shen Yu thought of the winter of the 17th year of Tongxiu. They met each other in the flames of war. Let's walk through the winter snow and the spring breeze together, and love each other passionately in the season of blooming mountain flowers. Auntie. Shen Yu turned her head, the floating clouds suddenly dispersed, and Xie Zhou smiled like a spring breeze. I love you. Full text ends, spreading flowers. The author has something to say. Getting ready was the beginning of my anxiety. As I watched the outline shrink little by little, I knew it was time to say goodbye again. I was glad to have told you another story, but I was also very reluctant to say goodbye. Xie Zhou and Shen Yu have been with me for several months, and they have gradually matured from a little vague idea in my mind to the point where I feel like they are alive. I cried with them for their losses and rejoiced for their victories, as if I had witnessed their lives. To be honest, I was very depressed while writing this article. I read Wang Engshi, Zhang Zhehan, Xian Qiji, Li Yu. I wanted to understand the culture and social status quo at that time from the stories of the ancients, but unfortunately, all I read from different stories from different eras was just the tragedy of history. Imperial power is the shackles that bind Li Zhaonian, and the outline is the shackles that bind me. Now that the outline is finished, I want to give everyone a shot first, because the author is going crazy. I want to let myself go in the extra chapter and write whatever comes to my mind, so you don't have to think about the logic of the extra chapter content, because there is no logic. Finally, I would like to thank everyone who has been accompanying me to catch up on updates. You have really given me a lot of encouragement. A friend who is also an author asked me if readers would quarrel. Can you curse? I said they were really great and would catch me typos every day. To tell you the truth, I was really proud of them at the time. Okay, enough nonsense, see you in the next one. Knowledge. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 302. The tea house was packed with seats because the storyteller in the tea house was eloquent, and the stories he told were also extremely interesting. The storyteller knocked the wood in his hand, and the tea house suddenly became quiet. Dear readers, today I will talk about King Balin and Princess Balin, who drove away foreign enemies and eliminated internal troubles, and then successfully retired 4 years ago. The audience in the building hissed. Even a 3-year-old knows the story of King Balin and his concubine. Let's tell it in a new way. That is. The storyteller stroked his beard and said, what I want to tell today are not the ones everyone has heard of, but some unknown stories. Everyone's ears immediately pricked up. What's an unknown story? 8 years ago, King Balin and his wife took charge of the dynasty, but 4 years ago they retired to leave their talents to the current emperor. Do you know why? This matter must start from the battle that year. King Balin was injured in that battle, which caused his body to deteriorate. It was really unsustainable. You only know that the battle between King Balin and the Beirong people won a beautiful victory. But I don't know the key to victory. Today I will tell you. It is said that the two armies were facing each other that day. The war drums were beating and the shouts of killing were loud. On one side was the King Yun guard wearing black armor. At that time, the king of Balin was holding a Jingshuang. He was tall and powerful, with sword eyebrows on his temples, and his eyes were like electricity. A roar can make enemies tremble. Everyone listened with great interest. Lying on the railing on the second floor was a handsome young man. He looked about 7 or 8 years old and had a doughy face. There is a young master of similar age next to him. If you look closely, you can see that their eyebrows are very similar. Their shields were like city walls, and their swords were like tigers. Wherever they passed, the enemies fell to the ground. The old storyteller spoke impassionedly, and the audience occasionally let out shocked exclamations. The young master listened with his chin propped up and couldn't help but yawned. Nonsense. He turned to look at the other child and asked, "Brother, do you think they are talking nonsense?" The boy ignored him, and the young master turned around again. It turned out that there was another person behind him, who looked about 10 years old. "Brother Xian, do you think they are talking nonsense?" The young man who was called Brother Xian smiled gently. "It is indeed somewhat different from what we know." The young master nodded with satisfaction. "Let me just say, giving up the throne to uncle is obviously because of my father's playfulness and laziness. His health has already recovered." On the battlefield, swords and guns clashed, and blood flowed freely. I saw King Balin rising up with his sword, and slashed across the body of the Beirong soldiers with one sword. The old storyteller paused, then slowly picked up the tea and took a sip. The person below stretched his neck. "What then? What happened next?" The old storyteller cleared his throat. The Beirong soldier screamed on the spot, and his body was cut in half by King Balin's knife. When he fell to the ground, his upper body was still crawling on the ground. The spectators in the hall were so excited that they felt as if they were on the battlefield and saw with their own eyes the scene of King Balin wielding his sword to kill the enemy. The young man upstairs rolled his eyes and couldn't help but raise his voice. "It's just nonsense. It's completely wrong." The old storyteller downstairs was taking a breather, and everything was quiet. Hearing this sentence, he immediately looked up and waved his hand when he saw it was a child. "Children, don't act nonsense. Go home to your parents." The young master hated being called a child, so he immediately slapped the railing and said, "You are obviously talking nonsense. King Balin is not what you said." "Oh," the old man became interested, "then tell me, what is King Balin like?" The boy next to him tugged on the young master's sleeve. The young master raised his arm to break away and said loudly, "The king of Balin is so weak that he has to be held by the princess when he walks far, otherwise he won't go. When eating shrimps, he has to be peeled by the princess, otherwise he won't eat them. Even fish has to be picked by the princess, so he is not as powerful as you say." The audience burst into laughter. The old man stroked his beard and said, "If King Balin knew that he was so weak in your eyes, I don't know what he would think." There was another burst of laughter downstairs, obviously not believing it. The young master was so angry that he grabbed the children beside him and said, "Brother, tell them, is this what I said? They won't listen even if you say it." "Don't care what they say." The other young master was obviously more calm. The old storyteller laughed again. "Little old man, I will continue to talk. Little baby, stop talking nonsense." The young master put his hands on his hips and his chest heaved with anger. Hearing this, it became even more outrageous. He grabbed a sword on the table and was about to jump down while holding onto the railing. As soon as I climbed over the railing, the back of my neck suddenly tightened. Someone grabbed me by the collar and lifted me up in the air. My legs kept kicking in the air. When he turned around and saw the person carrying him clearly, the child immediately stopped struggling and hung in the person's hand like a dried fish. Xie lifted the baby up and looked into his eyes. "You dare to draw your sword and kill people when you are not tall enough?" "Daddy, you're talking nonsense." The young master was forced to shrink his neck and retorted, "I'm already much taller than the sword." Xie put Xiaoyu down and asked, "How do you usually teach me?" Xiaoyu seemed to be a different person in front of Xie. Standing properly, "Father told me to listen to mother." "Then what?" Xie looked at her. Xiaoyu said, "Mom, just do it if you don't like it." Xie choked and looked back at the person behind him, with questioning eyes. Shen Yu blinked innocently and looked up at the beam above her head. She looked at one beam for a long time, as if she could see flowers. "Is what Mom said wrong?" Xiaoyu asked, raising her head. Xie couldn't get off the tiger, and said helplessly, Your mother must be right, but there must be conditions for doing it if you don't feel comfortable. What conditions? Must be taller than your father, at least taller than your mother. Xie Tingzhou said nonsense seriously. Xie Yu raised her head. She was really too tall. She was afraid she would never grow this tall in her life. If she really grew this tall, she might not be able to get married. But if he is taller than his mother, he should be fine in another 10 years. Xie Tingzhou patted Xie Yu's head and looked at Xie Jin aside. Why don't you look at your sister? Xie Jin said, my sister is more wild than my mother, I can't help it. Xie Tingzhou, your mother is gentle and sweet, not wild. This is what my uncle said, Xie Jin said seriously. Xie Tingzhou sighed in admiration, but when he turned around, Shen Yu was nowhere to be seen. Xian'er. Uncle Li Xian stepped forward. Xie Tingzhou leaned over and whispered in his ear, and Li Xian immediately laughed, I understand, uncle. Xie Tingzhou raised his feet and was about to leave, but Xie Yu hugged his legs suddenly. Dad, where are you going? Your mother and I are going to Linyan Island to meet an old friend, Xie Tingzhou said. I want to go too. You always take your mother out to play, but you don't even take us. Xie Tingzhou lifted Xie Yu away and said, when you grow up and get married, let your husband take you there. Xie Yu didn't let go, and his sleeve was pulled by Xie Jin. Sister, stop pestering Dad, let's go to Yian with brother Xian. A group of people were walking on the street. A man was followed by 3 children. He was tall and handsome, attracting countless passers-by's attention. However, the man in front had a slightly darker complexion. Shen Yu was waiting in front of the carriage. When she saw Xie Tingzhou approaching menacingly with her child, she couldn't help but ask, what's wrong? He pinched me. Xie Tingzhou pursed his lips. Who's pinching you? Xie Tingzhou pointed to the side, pointing to Xie Jin, then lifted the curtain and got on the carriage. The 3 children stood side by side, holding back laughter but not daring to laugh. Shen Yu pointed at Xie Jin and followed her into the carriage. Why did Jin'er take advantage of you? Xie Tingzhou leaned against the car wall and crossed his arms. He said they were going to Yin. Shen Yu's heart skipped a beat. Why are you going to Yin? Xie Tingzhou opened his eyes. What do you think? Xie Tingzhou suddenly stretched out his hand, pulled the person over and pressed him against the car wall. Is Zhangji sick? There was one letter in March and another in May. Who cares about the gifts he brought to his children? Who cares whether he is in Yian or where he is? Why doesn't he go to the underworld? Zhang Lianzi traveled all over the world, and would write a letter to every place he visited, telling about the local customs, and also bringing some gadgets to a few children. It happened that several children liked him very much, and Xie Tingzhou was so angry that he regretted not killing him back then. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the Concubine, Eliminating the Wife, Reborn, I Refuse to Marry the Scumbag and Marry the Prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 303. Chapter 303, Extra, Dream. Usually at times like this, as long as you follow Xie Tingzhou's hair, you can feel it smoothly in a moment. Shen Yu stretched out her head and pecked the corner of his lips, then just don't let the children go to Yin. Xie Tingzhou narrowed his eyes slightly. Where can they go if they don't go to Yin? Come with us to Linyan Island, Shen Yu said matter-of-factly. Xie Tingzhou was silent. After finally taking the time to get rid of these children and live a life of 2, are you really being controlled by an 8-year-old child? That's impossible. Xie Tingzhou opened the curtain and looked outside, and saw several children gathered together, whispering, obviously planning some conspiracy. If he couldn't even fight against a few dolls, he wouldn't be Xie Tingzhou anymore. Zai Feng. 11 Feng stepped forward and said, Master. Xie Tingzhou leaned on the windowsill and said quietly, "Go and prepare a carriage and take the young master and young lady with you." Xie Yu was so happy that he stomped his feet, leaned into Xie Jin's ear and said, "My brother still has a way." I just missed Xie Tingzhou's slight smile before putting down the curtain. The carriage went north along the official road. Xie Yu opened the curtain in front of the car and took a look. When he saw his father and mother's carriage in front, he retracted his head again. "I am bored." Xie Jin looked at him. "You said you wanted to go to Linian Island with your father and mother." "Then I didn't know this journey was so boring." Xie Yu held up her chin. "We've been walking for 3 days, and my father and mother didn't even get off the bus." "What's fun on the bus?" Xie Jin's immature eyebrows raised slightly. Her mind quickly turned around, and she suddenly opened the curtain and said, "Stop the car." The coachman held the reins and said, "Master, we haven't reached the place yet." The master said, "We won't stop until we reach the place." Xie Jin tried to jump down, but the coachman quickly reined in his horse. "Oh, my mistress, if he falls down, I'll have to whip him when I turn around." Xie Jin quickly jumped off the carriage, ran to the front and opened the curtain of the carriage, stood there immediately, and then looked back at Xie Yu. "What's wrong, brother?" Xie Yu didn't understand. Xie Jin pointed and said, "Come and see for yourself." There was no one in the carriage, it was clearly empty. Dad was deceived again. Xie Yu stamped his foot. "Dad, the big liar, Humph, if you don't let me follow you, I won't let you follow me. Let's go find Uncle Zhang." Xie Yu pointed forward, "Let's go to Yin." Li Xian held Xie Yu's hand. "It doesn't seem right." This road was clearly going north, and Yin was in the south. The 3 children were fooled into walking in the opposite direction for 3 days. The cruise ship goes down the river breeze blows on your face. "Is this okay?" Shen Yu asked worriedly. Xie Tingzhou put his hand on the railing and locked Shen Yu in his arms. "The guards are here, don't worry." Shen Yu turned around and said, "Xiao Yu definitely hates you. She's as easy to coax as you." Xie Tingzhou smiled like a fox. "When I bring her something later, she forgets everything. She still shouts 'Daddy, Daddy' more frequently than anyone else. The wind on the river is very cool at night. If we go down the river, we will reach Jing'ai'an in 15 or 16 days, and we will reach Yandao in another 10 days. 2 years ago, Li Jiafeng suddenly saw through the world of mortals and said he wanted to become a monk, so he went round and picked a place that turned out to be Linian Island. But this is not the first time he has called for becoming a monk. When he first wanted to become a monk 7 years ago, he gave up because shaving his head would affect his appearance. 5 years ago, I gave up because I couldn't eat meat and had to carry water. I went to Linian Island 2 years ago, but this time I stayed for a long time, staying there for 2 years. Xie Tingzhou and Shen Yu went to Linian Island to see what kind of fairy life Li Jiafeng lived. The boat was sailing day and night, and you could vaguely hear the sound of water breaking through the water while lying on the couch. Xie Tingzhou hadn't fallen asleep yet, but Shen Yu had already fallen asleep in his arms. He brushed the hair that was scattered around her face and thought of the daughter with all her teeth and claws. When Shen Yu was pregnant, Xie Tingzhou wanted a little girl who looked like Shen Yu. He wanted to see what Shen Yu looked like as a child, but Shen Yu also wanted a boy who looked like him. As a result, no one got what they wanted. Xie Jin was more like Shen Yu, while Xie Yu was more like Xie Tingzhou. The only similarity is their temperament. Xie Jin inherited Xie Tingzhou's scheming and arrogant nature, while Xie Yu inherited Shen Yu's wildness. He made love to wear men's clothes and said he wanted to imitate his mother in traveling in the world. Li Xian, on the other hand, was carved out of the same mold as his father Li Zhaonian. He was humble and polite in dealing with others at a young age. Xie Tingzhou closed his eyes, and the wind noise around him seemed to be louder. The tightly closed eyelids could not block the light, which was a bit dazzling. Xieting Zhou opened his eyes and found himself standing in front of the city gate of Yanliang Pass. There is no snow this season, the grassland outside the pass is a green field, and I don't know what time it is. The city behind him was very noisy, so Xieting Zhou turned around and walked towards Ganzhou City. Just as he was about to enter the passage of the city gate, his steps slowed down, he turned to look at the little man standing at the city gate, and then stopped completely. It was a 5 or 6-year-old girl with a double snail bun on her head. It seemed that the person who tied her hair was not very good at tying her hair, so it was tied crookedly and loosely. This was not what caught Xieting Zhou's eye. What attracted him was the fact that the female doll had a knife on its back. The knife was almost as tall as her. Xieting Zhou stepped forward. As soon as the girl raised her head to look at him, his heart trembled and he shouted softly, "Auntie!" Shen Yu's clear eyes looked up at him in confusion. He was too tall, and her neck felt sore when she raised her head. The sunlight made it difficult for her to see the man's face clearly. She only felt that he was almost reaching the sky. He was taller than her father and brother. Still high. "How do you know my name?" she asked. Xieting Zhou did not answer her, but squatted down in front of her with a smile. "What are you doing here?" Shen Yu looked him up and down. He was so handsome and had a nice voice. He didn't look like a bad guy. So she said in a sweet voice, "I'm waiting for my dad and my brother." Xieting Zhou's eyes were gentle. "Where are your father and brother?" Shen Yu opened her mouth, as if she wanted to answer subconsciously, and then quickly shook her head. "I can't say." "I can't say, it doesn't matter." Xieting Zhou looked at her intently. "Can I wait here with you?" Shen Yu's eyes moved, as if she was thinking, and after a while she shook her head. "No, Daddy said not to talk to people you don't know." Xieting Zhou laughed, "But we have already talked a lot, so what should we do?" Shen Yu blinked and silently moved a few steps to the side to avoid him, still staring outside the gate. Xieting Zhou looked at her profile. At this time, Shen Yu was still full of breasts, and her cheeks were bulging. Only her eyes were as clean and clear as they would be when she grew up. Xieting Zhou took a step toward her, and the little girl immediately moved 2 steps to the side. He moved again and she moved again, and finally she reached the base of the city wall. "Don't come here again," Shen Yu shouted loudly. His little face was angry and unhappy, and his eyes were wary. Xieting Zhou leaned over and looked at her and said, "I'm not a bad person, nor am I an unknown person." "Then who are you?" "I am your future husband," Xieting Zhou said softly. As soon as she finished speaking, the little girl became angry and said, "You are a scumbag." She wanted to pull out the knife on her back with her backhand, but her arms were not long enough. She held the handle of the knife and pulled it out a little, but it stopped moving. No matter how hard she tried to pull it out, she couldn't pull it out. Her eyes were so anxious that her eyes were red. Xieting Zhou asked tentatively, "Shall I help you?" After that, he helped her pull out the knife and put it into her hand. Perhaps Shen Zhongan was afraid that he would be injured. The sword looked like a serious scabbard, but when he pulled it out, it turned out to be a wooden sword. Shen Yu pointed the knife at Xieting Zhou. The handsome man in front of her was not afraid at all. He still looked at her with gentle eyes. Xieting Zhou said, "Look, I'm not a bad person." "How could a bad person help you draw a sword?" "Right." Shen Yu thought for a moment and realized that this was true. She wanted to imitate her brother in inserting the knife neatly into the scabbard, but her arms were not long enough. Xieting Zhou helped her put the knife back and asked her warmly, "Are you hungry?" Shen Yu shook her head, still wary of him and reluctant to talk to him. Nay, he had already squeezed into the corner and had no way to retreat, so he squatted on the ground. The knife was very long. When she squatted down, she poked the ground. The little girl fell forward. After holding on the ground to steady herself, she patted the dust on her hands and moved the rope tied to the knife upwards. Seeing that Xieting Zhou was still looking at her, the little girl squatted and turned in a circle, facing the corner. The scabbard dragged on the ground to draw a semicircle, leaving a silhouette of her back. She squatted there like a small potato, as short and round. Xieting Zhou's heart melted and turned into a puddle of water, which he could not hold up. Shen Yu faced the city wall and heard footsteps leaving. She couldn't help but look back and saw that the man was walking towards the city gate. After a while, the man came back and spread out the oil paper bag in front of him, with 4 pieces of pineapple cake inside. "Look, it's noon, you must be hungry, right?" Shen Yu shook her head, but couldn't move her eyes away from the thing in his hand. Xieting Zhou picked up a piece and took a bite. "Well, it's delicious. Don't you want to eat it?" The little girl in front of her swallowed her saliva and said, "Daddy said eating something so sweet will cause toothache." "It hurts if you eat too much," Xieting Zhou coaxed. "It won't hurt if you eat a few pieces." The chubby little hand slowly stretched out, and just as he was about to take it, someone grabbed it. Shen Yu wanted to shrink back, but Xieting Zhou took out the handkerchief and wiped it on her dusty hands bit by bit. Food is really something that can easily bring people closer together. Shen Yu ate pineapple cake and sat on the hillside with Xieting Zhou. She ate very slowly, biting her cheeks until her cheeks bulged, and she chewed for a long time before swallowing. Xieting Zhou thought to himself that he would have to go back and tell Xiao Yu that her mother was so cute when she was a child, but she didn't act like a crazy girl like her. Xieting Zhou fiddled with the chirping hair on Shen Yu's head. "Who tied your hair?" "It's my daddy," Shen Yu said while biting the pineapple cake. Xieting Zhou took apart the loose hair on one side of her hair, tied it into a beautiful little tutu, and fiddled with it with his fingers. "Am I okay?" Shen Yu nodded. "Okay. Then when you grow up, I will marry you, okay?" The little girl was stunned for a moment, and her face became a little panicked. Then, what should Brother Zhuang do? "Brother Zhuang," Xieting Zhou asked with a smile. "Who is Brother Zhuang?" Shen Yu said seriously, "Brother Zhuang is the most powerful, strongest, and most handsome brother in our street." At this point, Xieting Zhou didn't realize anything yet. Then the little girl added, "We have agreed that he will join the army when he grows up, and then I will marry him." The warm expression of the man in front of him immediately darkened, causing the little girl to shrink back in fear. "It really can't be done," the little girl said anxiously. "We all have made an appointment." Xieting Zhou suppressed his unhappiness and told himself that this was just a dream. But not even in dreams. He asked her, "You like people who are good at fighting, strong, and good looking, right?" "Yes," Shen Yu nodded and added, "I still want to join the army." Xieting Zhou asked, "Then is he as good looking as me?" Shen Yu honestly said, "No." Xieting Zhou smiled, "Well, you see, I'm better looking than him, I'm better at fighting now, and I'm definitely stronger than him, and I've already joined the army, so do you want to consider changing to someone else?" Shen Yu was a little confused, but Xieting Zhou kept up his efforts. "Did he go to your house to hire someone?" "What is a lower job?" Shen Yu asked innocently. Xieting Zhou explained, "The engagement is to confirm that you want to marry him. Without the engagement, nothing will count." "Is that so?" Shen Yu thought for a while and said, "No, then I'll go back and ask him if he wants to come to my house to hire someone." Xieting Zhou was furious. After talking about it for a long time, he was still making wedding clothes for others. "Don't ask." Xieting Zhou made a decisive decision. "I will go to your house tomorrow to hire someone." The sound of horse hooves came from far away, and a group of cavalry came running from the pasture outside the pass. Shen Yu's eyes lit up. She stood up, spread her short legs and ran forward. "Dad, brother." The man on the horse raised his whip and sped up, bent down and picked up Shen Yu from the ground and put her on the horse's back. The man smiled heartily. "Ah, you, why did you run out to pick up Daddy again?" Xieting Zhou looked from afar, a smile appeared on his face, watching his girl laughing wantonly in her father's arms. The horse is about to pass through the city gate. Shen Yu turned around on her horse and looked at the figure on the hillside. Then she raised her head and asked, "Dad, a very handsome uncle will come to my house tomorrow to hire me. Is that okay?" Shen Zhong'an rubbed her head in confusion. "What are you talking about? What uncle?" Shen Yu pointed to the hillside. "It's over there." Shen Zhong'an turned his head and saw only the undulating green grass on the hillside. "Where is it?" Shen Yu looked doubtfully, but saw that the figure was still standing there, looking at her, and then he opened his lips and said something to her. Her ears were full of wind and she couldn't hear what he said. She didn't remember until the horse passed through the city gate. Even though they were so far apart, those words seemed to penetrate into her heart. She heard him say, "Don't be afraid of anything you encounter in the future, Au. I will always be here waiting for you." Xieting Zhou looked at the empty city gate. They parted here, and his Au would go through hardships later, but they would eventually meet here. The sound of wind was replaced by the sound of water. Xieting Zhou opened his eyes and saw the moonlight streaming in from the window, and the cruise ship was still sailing. The little girl, who was carrying a sword about the same height as a person and holding two chirps, had grown up and was sleeping quietly in his arms. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 304. The river breeze passed through the window and was obviously cool, but Shen Yu felt that her whole back was burning in her sleep. Fang moved forward a little, and then was dragged back by someone's waist. The tip of his ear hurt, and he woke up completely. "Look at the moonlight, it seems like it's only the third watch." "Where are you hiding?" Xieting Zhou leaned close to him, "Looking for your Zhuang brother." Shen Yu was not yet fully awake from her sleep, so she didn't hear clearly what he asked. Through the moonlight, she could vaguely see a slight displeasure on Xieting Zhou's face. "You were fine before going to bed, but you only slept in the middle of the night. Why are you suddenly unhappy?" "It's hot," Shen Yu said, but she didn't hide aside. She let Xieting Zhou hold her in his arms. "Why don't you sleep in the middle of the night?" "Can't sleep, let's talk." Xieting Zhou wanted to bite her neck and her ears. "What to talk about?" "Let's talk about your strong brother." Shen Yu blinked and her mind wandered for a long time before finally searching for such a person from her memory. "Did my brother tell you?" "So there really is such a person." He lay on his side beside her, supporting his head. "Come, tell your husband about your Zhuang brother." Shen Yu looked at him inexplicably. What does he have to say? For example? Xieting Zhou opened her clothes little by little with his fingertips. "Tell me, did he ever hold your hand? After 2 lives, many memories from my childhood are no longer clear." Shen Yu tried hard to recall that it was like playing with the dolls when they were young, such as when they jumped into puddles, they would always hold hands. Little did he know that the way she was thinking hard fell into Xieting Zhou's eyes, and it was already an affirmative answer. There was a sudden pain in her neck, followed by a numbness and itching. Xieting Zhou raised his head from her neck, his eyes like those of a wolf. Shen Yu wanted to reach out and touch the bitten neck. As soon as she raised her hand, her wrist was grabbed and pressed against the pillow. A fingertip slowly traced down from the neck. "It seems that Madame has not made people worry since she was a child." Xieting Zhou's body raised his head from the contact, and when he pressed it down, the outline of the close contact became more obvious. The air gradually became hotter and hotter, as if the wind had avoided this place. One hand reached out from the edge of the bed, and before it touched the small table next to it, it was pulled back and pressed against the pillow. "The debt has not been repaid. Why are you running?" "I'm thirsty." The weakness in the voice did not make the person above stop, but the violent thoughts only became stronger. Xieting Zhou straightened up, lifted the teapot and drank a sip of cold tea. then leaned forward to kiss her again, lingering with her in the slightly bitter cold tea. Shen Yu felt like she couldn't breathe. She tilted her head slightly and the tea flowed from the corner of her lips to her neck. Xie Zhou kissed all the way along the water trail. When he raised his head, he saw that her lips were soaked in tea and were glistening. The bright red on them was his masterpiece. The raised neck and the contentment in the corners of her eyes were all silent tributes to him. Seduce. Let's have another baby. Xie Zhou kissed her. I want another girl. Isn't there Xiao Yuer? I want one just like you, with 2 little juju and a sword taller than a person. Shen Yu's consciousness was no longer clear. How did you know? I dreamed about it. Xie Zhou recalled that she had said seriously in her dream that she wanted to marry brother Zhuang Chuang. It seemed that she was much braver in the dream than in reality. He grabbed her waist and suddenly turned her over. There was a thin layer of sweat on her arched back. He stretched out his hand and touched it, which brought tears to his eyes. Shen Yu turned around, her eyes soaked in mountain mist were filled with silent accusations. It's heavy. Xie Zhou said with malice, don't you like strong people? Why do I feel like I'm not strong enough? Xie Zhou was bad. He repeatedly revolved around those topics and asked her if he was good looking. Is your Zhuang brother better looking or me? Is brother Zhuang as strong as me? He wanted to enjoy herself, and liked to see her expression, the patient frown, the unbearable trembling, and the momentary absence of concentration were all silent encouragement to him. The night was suddenly shortened, and the curtains were lowered at dawn. The knock on the door failed to wake up the person in her arms. Xie Zhou stood up and saw traces of last night all over her waist. What's up? The door was suddenly opened, and Bai Yu fluttered about to fly in, but was blocked by Xie Zhou, and the door closed again behind Xie Zhou. The person in front of him was wearing a loose burqa, his face was full of contentment, and his whole body exuded the laziness after a hearty drink. Xifeng glanced at it and didn't dare to look again. He lowered his eyes and stared at the wooden board under his feet. Master, 11 Feng said, we have arrived in Lingen. The Lingen County Sheriff will send someone to meet us at the ferry. Xie Zhou asked, how did the county governor of the other case know that we would arrive in Lingen at this time? Xie Zhou took a few steps forward. The river wind blew up and rolled up his wide sleeves. He raised his hand, and the white feather on the railing immediately jumped onto his arm. Bai Yu's claws were still as powerful as usual, and he even used a little more strength to express his displeasure at being blocked just now. Xie Zhou was not wearing armbands, so the force seemed a bit heavy. He frowned and said, take it easy. The words blurted out, and then the person lost his mind. I remembered that Shen Yu had issued such reminders countless times in the evening, and she had trembled under his gaze countless times. Master. Xie Zhou came to his senses, what did you just say? Xifeng repeated, I guess the Fenyang County magistrate may have revealed our itinerary after we left Fenyang. Xie Zhou had not planned to go at first, but changed his mind after hearing Xifeng's words. He has been in charge of the government for 4 years, and everyone knows that he does not like his courtiers to form cliques. Now that he has only been abdicated for 4 years, someone has the courage to step on his bottom line. Go and have a look. Xie Zhou touched Bai Yu's fur, put it back on the railing, and returned to the cabin. Seeing Shen Yu sleeping soundly, he changed his clothes. When leaving the house, he told the maids and guards to escort her to the governor's house in Lingen when she woke up. The cruise ship docked at the port on the riverside of Lingen City. Xie Zhou disembarked, and the Lingen County Sheriff had been waiting there under the bright sun. Seeing Xie Zhou from a distance, he held up his robe and wanted to kneel down. When he saw Xie Zhou lightly swiping his fingers, he got the order and hurried forward to greet him. Lingen County Sheriff met Xie Zhou when he went to Beijing to report on his duties a few years ago. At that time, Zhou was still regent as the king of Balin. After many years, I actually feel that King Balin is still the same as before. He has not aged, but the power he exudes is not as strong as before, and he seems to be much easier to talk to than before. By dash. Xifen interrupted, my master doesn't show his identity outside, so you can just call me son. Yes, young master. The county guard cupped his hands and said, the official is hosting a banquet in the mansion and invites the young master and his wife to have a casual meal at the mansion. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 305. Shen Yu slept until noon. The maid prepared water and waited beside him with clothes in her hands. After washing herself, she set off for Ling'an city. The last time I came to Ling'an was 6 years ago, so long ago. As the carriage drove through the streets of Ling'an city, Shen Yu raised the curtain and looked out. Street vendors are hawking their goods, and pedestrians are bustling, which shows its prosperity. The guards rode their horses and watched the passers-by from time to time to prevent any bad people from getting involved. The carriage was not moving very fast. When Kono looked back, he saw a little boy in dirty clothes following behind him. They had already walked 2 streets, but the boy had not yet been lost. The boy was dirty and his hair was messy. The guard gestured to the person behind him, and the guard behind him took out a handful of coins. Little beggar, go buy some buns to eat, don't follow me. The little beggar shook his head, I'm not a beggar, I don't want money. Then what do you want? Kono asked. The little beggar pointed forward with his dirty finger, I want to see the sister in the carriage. Kono's expression changed, that's our wife, not everyone can see her, hurry up. The little beggar didn't want to leave, but he saw the knife on the tall guard's waist and was forced to stop. We had dinner at the county magistrate's house. It turned out to be a misunderstanding. Shen Zhao got a good piece of jade and made several jade pendants. 2 pieces were given to his children, and the other 3 pieces were given to Xiejin, Xiaoyu, and Li Xian. Xietingzhou and Shen Yu had no fixed residence for more than a year and had been walking and stopping on the road. Shen Zhao knew that they would pass through Ling'an, so he sent the jade pendant to Ling'an and asked the Ling'an county sheriff to hand it over. The county guard was afraid of missing out, so he had been waiting at the port for half a month, and finally got the person. Xietingzhou was just passing through Ling'an and didn't want to stay here any longer, so he took Shen Yu away after the banquet. Back at the port, Kono found the little beggar from before, mingling among the crowd. When he saw people getting off the carriage, his eyes suddenly lit up, he pushed through the crowd and rushed towards this direction. With quick eyesight and quick hands, Kono grabbed the little beggar by his collar and picked him up. Boy, what do you want to do? Seeing that the beautiful sister was about to get on the boat, the little beggar suddenly became anxious, shouting anxiously, and struggling desperately. Sister, sister, let me go, help me. I'm beating someone. Shen Yu had already stepped onto the boat and vaguely heard the cry of the child. She turned around and saw the guard carrying a struggling child. Go and ask what's going on, Shen Yu said. The maid asked after getting off the boat, and when she came back she said that the little beggar had been following them since they got off the boat, all the way to the sheriff's mansion, and from the sheriff's mansion to the port. It's a lost child somewhere, Shen Yu guessed and asked the maid to bring him over and ask. The little beggar was taken aboard and stood in front of Shen Yu, all dirty. He reached out to take her hand, but was stopped by the guard's scabbard. Boy, don't do it. The little beggar stepped back a little in fear and looked up at her. Sister, I have seen you. Kono warned, this is our wife, don't yell. Shen Yu raised her hand to stop her, squatted down and asked, where have you seen me? In a dream, the little beggar said seriously. Everyone present burst into laughter. Xifen knocked the little beggar on the head, you know how to trick people at such a young age. Fortunately, Our master is not here. When the master comes later, we can't talk nonsense anymore. The little beggar remained unmoved and stared at Shen Yu. I'm not lying. It's true. He scratched his disheveled hair again, with doubt in his eyes, but my sister doesn't wear such clothes in her dreams. Then what should I wear? Shen Yu asked funnily. The little beggar pointed at Zai Feng. Wear something like this, with your hair tied up high. Everyone who had been laughing just now stopped laughing and looked at the little beggar cautiously. Zai Feng's hand had already subconsciously pressed down on the knife at his waist. As guards, they must remain vigilant at all times. As long as they are not in a state of complete control, they must be ready to draw their swords at any time, and the boy in front of him is within his unknown range. Shen Yu was also stunned for a moment. All in all, it had been almost 9 years since she had worn men's clothing, and the boy in front of her looked only 5 or 6 years old. How had he ever seen her wearing men's clothing? What do I look like in your dream? Shen Yu asked patiently. The little beggar thought for a while and said, in the dream, you don't move. You stand and don't blink. Zai Feng thought for a moment and said, this child must have seen Madame's portrait and thought it was in a dream. The little beggar's eyes lit up. It's just a portrait, but it was really in a dream. I didn't lie. Shen Yu saw that the material on the little beggar was quite good. He didn't look like a wandering beggar, but probably a lost child from some family. Tell me, where is your home? In the east of Ling'an City. My father is a member of the Communist Party of China. Then you got lost. The little beggar shook his head. I ran out secretly on my own. There is a dog hole in my backyard. I crawl out of there every day and wait for you at the dock. It seemed like either the kid knew they were going to pass by, or he was just making it up. Shen Yu asked, how did you know I would be here? I dreamed about it. My brother in the dream told me. He asked me to wait for you here. It's a dream again. Shen Yu laughed. Then tell me, what did you dream about in your dream? The little beggar said, there was a brother in my dream. He had a painting, and the painting was you. What does that brother look like? The little beggar raised his head and thought, he is very tall and loves to laugh. His eyes are crooked when he smiles. Oh, there is a mole on his ear, right here. The little beggar reached out and pointed at his ear, but saw that the face of the beautiful sister in front of him had darkened. What else? Shen Yu's voice began to tremble. Pei Chunli loves to laugh. When he smiles, his eyes are crooked and there happens to be a small mole on his earlobe. The little beggar said, my brother said that if I help him with things, he will help me cure my grandma. My grandma is sick and has never recovered. What did he ask you to do for him? Brother asked me to tell you that he has helped his father pay off his debt down below. Now he wants to reincarnate, but he is afraid that he will not be able to find you after reincarnation, so he keeps waiting and waiting. Shen Yu suddenly covered her mouth, tears rolled down and covered the back of her hands. What else did he say? Brother said he was going to be reborn in Ling'an and asked my sister to remember to come find him in 18 years. Shen Yu burst into tears, her eyes blurred, and she heard the little beggar ask, you will come to him, right? 18 years later. No. Shen Yu shook her head and held the little beggar's shoulders. You tell him that I will not go to him. You let him come to me and let him be my child. In this life, I will protect him. As I said before, the extras are the author's crazy literature, purely to relieve stress, so don't focus on logic, don't, just watch it for fun. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the Concubine, Eliminating the Wife, Reborn, I Refuse to Marry the Scumbag and Marry the Prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 306. Xie Tingzhou felt that Shen Yu was a little too enthusiastic tonight. When he came back, he saw her eyes were red and she had obviously cried. When he asked Kono, he said she was remembering things from the past. Xietingzhou only knew that she met a little beggar, chatted with the little beggar for a while, then changed into a clean little robe, ate something, and sent him away. When the world was first established, there were still many refugees and beggars in every state. Shen Yu had already started to arrange for war orphans even when she was pregnant. War orphans are the best way to see the tragic situation, those children who lost their parents in the war. Men went out to fight, and many of them had children who were not yet born, or even men who left home to fight just after their children were born. And once they died on the front line, their families were not prosperous enough, leaving only women and children who were forced to become widows. Such situations were countless in every dynasty. They were fighting for the people of the world, and Shen Yu could not let their children become orphans. At that time, she was worried about how to arrange the orphans every day, and it took her a lot of time to arrange them properly. Xietingzhou thought she was crying like that because she remembered the tragic situation that year. The hot flashes in the tent were very hot. Xietingzhou had just taken a bath when she came to him again. After nearly 10 years of marriage, Xietingzhou had rarely seen her in such a passionate mood. He was naturally happy, and his mind and body were almost bursting with fire, as if he was celebrating a festival. Xietingzhou gasped and asked, "What happened today?" "I want to have another child." Shen Yu hooked his neck. Xietingzhou smiled and moved the tip of his nose along her neck. "Didn't you say no last night? Have you figured it out?" Shen Yu blinked. "I want a boy." The fire in Xietingzhou's body was half extinguished, and it was against her forehead. "Aren't there Jinner and Xian'er? 2 boys at home are not enough." He just wanted a cute little girl with 2 little chirps like in his dream. If it was a boy, he didn't dare to think about it, it gave him a headache just thinking about it. Shen Yu didn't know how to tell Xietingzhou. With his jealous nature, he would probably be unhappy if he found out. If he followed her, he would have to feel depressed in his heart, and she couldn't bear to make him sad. "What are you thinking about?" Xietingzhou turned her face over and asked her to look at him. "Then just let it go." Shen Yu rubbed his ears. "I can't decide whether it's a boy or a girl. I thought that if it was really a girl, I would have no choice but to wrong Pei Chunli." Thinking that if it was really a girl, Xietingzhou would give Pei Chunli 2 little tweets, the thought of that scene made people laugh. "Why are you laughing?" Xietingzhou pinched her waist. "You're not smiling." Shen Yu squirmed to avoid him. "Hey, don't pinch, don't pinch." It was getting hot again in the cabin. Shen Yu wanted to stay a few more days, so they stopped in Lingen. The next day, the little beggar came again, standing under the boat and calling his sister. Xietingzhou stood at the bow of the boat and took a look and asked, "Is that the little beggar from yesterday?" Zifeng replied, "Yes." He was told by Shen Yu not to tell Xietingzhou about this matter. They were both masters and he didn't dare to offend either of them. He could only listen to the one who spoke first. Even if it is exposed at that time, Madam said so is enough to silence the master. This is family status. Xietingzhou raised his chin and said, "Let him come up." Zifeng was pounding in his heart, thinking that he might not be able to hide it now. He signaled the guard with his eyes to invite the lady to come over to calm down the place, and then put the little beggar up. The little beggar got on the boat and looked around. "Where's the sister from yesterday?" Just as Zifeng was about to speak, Xietingzhou asked, "She is my wife, what are you doing with her?" 11 Feng kept winking. The little beggar was still young and couldn't understand it at all. He looked up at Xietingzhou and said, "I just told her that I didn't dream yesterday." 11 Feng breathed a sigh of relief, just as Shen Yu arrived. "Axi, why are you dirty again today?" When the little beggar saw Shen Yu, he immediately smiled and said, "I'm going into a dog hole." Dog holes are dirty. The little beggar's name is Axi, the youngest son of Yuan Liu's maternal wife in the east of the city. Axie added, I dress cleanly every day, but I get dirty after walking through a dog hole. Shen Yu asked the maid to wipe Axie's face, while she stood next to Xie Zhou and touched him lightly. Aren't boys cute too? Xie Zhou nodded. Although there are two boys in the family, Xie Jin is naturally serious, while Li Xian is gentle and elegant. Both of them are mature at a young age, and it is rare for them to be so innocent and cute. Xie Zhou looked at the dirty child and actually had the idea of having another son. Shen Yu knew that this matter could not be kept secret for long, and she would have to tell Xie Zhou sooner or later. Rather than letting him learn about it from others, it was better to tell him herself. That's how it is. After Shen Yu finished speaking, she looked at him. Xie Zhou frowned slightly. It was already evening, and the setting sun and the breeze together covered the river surface with a layer of golden fish scales. Shen Yu didn't interrupt. She knew that this was indeed a bit strange to say. He needed time to accept it, so she kept waiting by the side without urging him. Xie Zhou thought for a moment and turned to look at Shen Yu. Seeing that her expression was slightly nervous, he knew that she cared about him. Come here. Xie Zhou reached out to her and pulled her to him. Really want it? Shen Yu pursed her lips and nodded, I think so. Xie Zhou was silent. That's it? Shen Yu was startled and raised her head to look at his face. Xie Zhou pressed her head on his chest, I will accompany you and protect him together. They waited for another day in Lingen, and Axie came running early in the morning. Before Shen Yu woke up, Xie Zhou heard a knock on the door and reached out to pat Shen Yu on the back. After she stopped moving, he stood up, put on his robe and opened the door. Master, that little. Xie Zhou raised his finger and the guard immediately fell silent. Xie Zhou looked back, closed the door and went onto the deck, where the little beggar named Axie was there. Are you here to deliver news again? Xie Zhou walked over, rubbing the back of his neck. Is the person named Pei here to deliver a message again? In the past, Xie Zhou didn't believe in ghosts and gods, but since that night he dreamed about Shen Yu when she was a child, he felt that he shouldn't completely disbelieve it. Axie nodded, brother said he won't come. Xie Zhou stopped rubbing the back of his neck and looked down at A11, why? Axie said, he said he didn't want to call someone named Xie daddy. Axie raised her head and asked innocently, uncle, who is that person named Xie? Xie Zhou, you call my wife sister and you call me uncle. Axie took 2 steps back in fear, brother said you must understand etiquette. Kono suppressed his laughter until his cheek almost twitched, and then he saw his master's jaw move. What else did he say? You also asked me to give a message to Xie. Xie Zhou turned the finger on his hand and said, tell me. Axie thought for a while, my brother said he wouldn't come. Another reason is that he doesn't know if Xie can do it. If not, he will have to wait for 10.5 years. Axie watched the face of the person in front of her become darker and darker, and she was so scared that her voice became smaller and smaller. I don't understand what is okay and what is not okay. Xie Zhou smiled instead of getting angry. Very good, this style is very Pei Chunli, no matter life or death, he likes to step on his minefield. You are sure that he is dead and there is nothing you can do to him, right? A sinister smile appeared on Xie Zhou's face. Zai Feng. Master. Xie Zhou turned his head and said, go find some Taoist priests. This. Zai Feng said in surprise, what are you looking for a Taoist priest for? Catch ghosts. Xie Zhou leaned over and stared into Axie's eyes, tell that silly brother of yours to hide and don't get caught by me. But Axie couldn't help but say, my brother has already been reincarnated. Xie Zhou. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 307. There was a family named Shui in the east of Lingen City, not far from Lu Yuan's wife's house. They started a fabric business and had several shops in Lingen City. Although he is not rich and powerful, he does have enough food and clothing. Mr. Xue's name was Xueshi. He married 5 concubines and gave birth to 11 daughters in total. I thought I was destined to have no children, but when I turned 40, my wife, who was nearly 40 years old, became pregnant again. The doctors said that Ms. Xue should still be a girl based on her body shape, but she was born fat. Boy! Xueshile was so happy that he held a full moon banquet in his mansion, donated incense to the temple, and distributed money and porridge. The Xue mansion was decorated with lanterns and colorful decorations, and was full of guests and friends. Xueshi greeted the guests back and forth, grinning from ear to ear with joy. The servants came to report again, saying that the governor of Ling'an County had brought distinguished guests, and they hurriedly took the servants out to welcome them. A couple came with the county guard. Both of them were very handsome. Xueshi had never seen such a good-looking person before. Looking at the county guard's attitude towards those 2 people, we knew that those 2 people were not ordinary people. Shen Yu and Xieting Zhou have stayed in Ling'an for more than a month. After A11 left that day, Shen Yu burst into tears, and then went to find out which women in Ling'an were pregnant or had just given birth recently. After this investigation, there really happened to be a family who could match the number at the right time, and it was Xue Mansion. When Xueshi ushered the distinguished guest in, he saw a maid running over in a hurry. "Master, it's not good. The young master has been crying since just now. He can't be comforted no matter what. He's crying so much, he's almost dying." When Xueshi heard this, he didn't care about anything else and hurried inside. Just listen to the baby crying loudly, already sobbing and hiccuping from crying. A group of people were busy surrounding the young master of the Xue family. They tried every method, but they couldn't coax him. Shen Yu stood in front of the corridor, took a deep breath, and then stepped forward. "Can I hug him?" As soon as the words came out, her eyes turned red. Before Xueshi had time to answer, he saw the child tilting his head and extending his hand in the direction of the distinguished guest. Shen Yu carefully took the baby. He was so soft and fragile when he held her, and his dark eyes looked at her. He stopped crying immediately and was still sobbing. Everyone was overjoyed and praised him wildly. This is really fate. This child has been smart since he was a child. He knows that the distinguished guest is coming. This is good news. Shen Yu hugged the child, and her tears finally couldn't stop falling. The baby stretched out his hand, trying to touch her face but couldn't reach it. His mouth flattened and he was about to start crying again. She leaned over, brought her face close, and let his soft little hands touch her. "Ouch!" The maid smiled and said, "You know you like a beautiful sister at such a young age." Shen Yu choked up, "This is Anan. He is her best friend and her best playmate. Even if they are different people, they are still close to each other." Xieting Zhou stepped forward and looked at the baby in Shen Yu's arms. He looked just as stupid as Pei Chunli. He couldn't help but curl his lips with a smirk. "Don't you want to call him Dad? Do you think you can escape by reincarnating in another family? How come you are still so naive after 2 lives?" "Master Xue," Xieting Zhou said. Mr. Xue quickly handed over his hand and said, "Don't dare, don't dare. My surname is Xue Dan. If you have anything to do with me, please tell me." Xieting Zhou glanced at the baby in Shen Yu's arms and said, "I think this child is blessed and I would like to adopt him as my adopted son. Do you have any objections?" Not to mention Xueshi, even the county guard was startled and hurriedly pulled Xueshi's sleeve. "Quick, quick, quick, why don't you thank me quickly?" the county guard said quickly, but luckily no one noticed. He thought to himself, why did this pie fall on Xueshi's head? This is King Balin. To be the adopted son of King Balin is a blessing that our ancestors could not achieve in 8 lifetimes. This godfather was not in vain, he was very generous with his money. He had 10 shops and 10,000 taels of silver. Did you name it? Xueshi hurriedly replied, get up, I specially asked a master to name the dog. What's it called? Xieting Zhou asked. Xueshidao, the single name has the character Nan. Shen Yu raised her head and met Xieting Zhu's gaze, with obvious surprise in her eyes. It seems that he is really a master. The master is in the mansion. Xueshi ordered his servants to invite him. After a while, a man walked through the archway. He was dressed in a plain white monk's robe, with a wide robe and large sleeves. He walked silently, but he looked to be in his early 20s. Walking closer, the monk clasped his hands and said, Amitabha, this poor monk named Xianjing, who is looking for me. Xieting Zhou glanced at Xianjing. Master named him Nan, does it have a meaning? Yes, Xianjing nodded, this was his name in his previous life. Xueshi's cheeks twitched, haha, master really loves to joke. Monks don't tell lies, Xianjing said, this son's name is Nan, which can ensure peace for the rest of his life. Shen Yu looked at the child. He was already asleep. Maybe he would remember the past, maybe he wouldn't, but that didn't matter. She just wanted him to be safe in this life. We'll see each other eventually, right? When people who leave have concerns, they will come back and they will meet again. The cruise ship broke through the water and traveled along the river. Xianjing stood on the bow of the boat, and the river wind stirred his wide sleeves and clothes. Xianjing came from Linyan Island and went in the same direction as them, so he took them along for the ride. He turned to look at Shen Yu, Madam, I have a destiny with today's baby. Why? Xianjing, it's not only the fate of the past life, but also the fate of this life. The following is an excerpt of lyrics from I Remember by Zhao Lei. She told me many stories about your growth. On the other side of the starry sky, my thoughts never stop, just like the name on the tombstone. Don't cry, my dearest person, my best playmate. Time and space are a circle, go straight or turn, we will meet each other eventually. At a certain corner of the city, as the sun sets, in a certain window screen of thousands of lights. People get together with amnesia. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 308. Xieting Zhou wanted to break the relationship that Xianjing said. The couch was rolled by the waves, and he withdrew at the most critical moment, pouring the hot tide on her body. Shen Yu's misty eyes were left, looking at him in confusion. Didn't you say you wanted a daughter? Xieting Zhou breathed suppressedly, I don't want it anymore. Why? Shen Yu gradually woke up. Xieting Zhou hugged her waist, I'm afraid that after working hard to raise her for more than 10 years, she will be taken away by a pig. This is what Xieting Zhou suddenly thought of after leaving Shui Mansion. If he had another cute daughter with 2 little tweets, whom he pampered like a baby, but ended up taking advantage of Pei Chunli, he would be so angry that he would vomit blood. Shen Yu snickered, actually, I was cuter when I was younger. My brother said that when I was 2 or 3 years old, I was chubby and had a bulging belly. I was a real little potato. Xieting Zhou seemed to see that little girl through the years in her chatter. She swayed when she walked and spoke in a milky voice. It's over, he still wants one. He knew that this was Shen Yu Runwu's silent trick, but he really couldn't resist the temptation of the fat girl with the little chirping hair. Forget it, it can last for more than 10 years, right? He can also teach his daughter a lesson when she is young. As long as the men named Nan or Ji are named, they should stay away from each other. The end of Tanjiang River is Yongquan Port. There are many sails here, ships come and go, workers loading and unloading goods are busy going back and forth, and vendors on the shore are shouting their goods at the top of their lungs, attracting the attention of passers-by. The cruise ship stopped at the port, Xianjing said goodbye and disembarked. Changliu stood on the deck and asked, isn't he also going to Linyan Island? Why isn't he with us? Chang Liu met them on the way. After finishing his errands, he went to Yian port to wait, and boarded the ship on the way. 11 Feng sat on the edge of the railing and said, "There is another family in the city that needs him to come and pray." Chang Liu nodded thoughtfully, "It's just to make some money. Many monks are like this." "This is different." Xifeng turned his body and whispered, "This master and the prince played chess, and the game was back and forth." "That's really impressive." Chang Liu sighed. "There is something even more powerful," Xifeng said. He inexplicably congratulated a helmsman the day before, and the helmsman received news the next day that his wife was pregnant. Chang Liu listened with interest. "What then?" "Then the helmsman threw himself into the river." Chang Liu opened his eyes wide. "Why?" Xifeng said calmly, "Because the helmsman hasn't been home for 3 months. Chang Liu looked at the monks retreating back and thought for a moment, "Brother Feng, how long will we stay at the port?" "In 2 hours, go to Linyan Island to buy some good things." "Aren't you going to wait for that monk?" "No, wait." As soon as he finished speaking, he heard the rustling of the wind and several exclamations from under the boat. A figure chased the white-robed monk in a few leaps, turning a deaf ear to the shouts of the wind behind him. Chang Liu chased for a while, and when he landed, his breathing was not disturbed at all. "Master, master, wait for me." Xianjing kept walking. "May I ask the donor what you want?" Chang Liu stood side by side with him. "I have some questions that I would like to ask the master for advice." "Don't take it seriously when asking for advice, just ask the donor." "That's it," Chang Liu said embarrassedly. "I have raised several turtles for almost 10 years, but they are not giving birth to babies. What should I do?" "Master, can you help me do the math? Are they destined to have no children?" Suanjing's eyebrows twitched, obviously not expecting such a question. "I'm sorry, the poor monk is not good at this." Xianjing clasped his hands together and said, "Donor, the poor monk is here, please come back." Chang Liu glanced at it with a little disappointment. In front of him was a magnificent mansion, which must be where Xianjing was going to pray. Xieting Zhou did not find Li Jifeng on Linyan Island. Linyan Island is not big, and there is only one temple on the island. There are about 10 monks in the temple, and they all say that they have never seen a person named Li Jifeng. The monks in the temple said that only 2 uncles are not there. So a few hours after the cruise ship left the port, it returned to Yongquan port and found an inn to settle down. Most likely he ran away because he couldn't bear the hardship of living in the temple, Xieting Zhou said. "But didn't he say in the letter that he had definitely escaped into Buddhism this time?" Xieting Zhou glanced sideways at Shen Yu. "Do you believe what he said?" Master Xifeng knocked on the door outside. "There is a letter from the inn, and it's from General Xiao." "Bring it in." 11 Feng handed over the letter and did not leave, waiting for his master to give instructions after reading the letter. Shen Yu read the letter quickly, with a frown in front of her, and her brows widened as she read. "What did you write?" Xieting Zhou asked. Shen Yu pinched the letter and said, "Xian and Tays who are suffering from drought, and the imperial court has allocated relief funds. The good news is that Xiao Chuan's wife has given birth to another fat boy." 11 Feng also laughed. "Thanks for being here for a long time. He can't hear a word about who has given birth to a child again, and he has to hold his turtle and cry, just like an old rich man who has cut off his descendants. He's in his early 20s. Xieting Zhou looked at Xifeng. "Didn't you teach him a lesson? He hangs out with men and turtles all the time." 11 Feng said, You can't blame me." After saying that, he glanced at Xieting Zhou and thought that if you hadn't stuffed women into Chang Liu's house, he wouldn't be so scared that he would hide away when he saw a woman now. "He didn't let me teach," Xifeng said. "He bought some random books to read, saying he wanted to thoroughly study the infertility of turtles. 2 days ago, I saw him reading a book about sows. Postpartum care. He said these things are interoperable." Xieting Zhou was speechless for a moment and asked, Where are the others? He ran away and probably went to the veterinarian again for advice. Xieting Zhou nodded slightly, his eyes casually swept through the window, and the bustling scene on the street downstairs came into view. Just as he looked away, he looked down again, feeling something was wrong. The man was really too conspicuous in the crowd. He was dressed in plain white monk robes, holding a string of Buddhist beads in his hand, and walked in a leisurely manner. Next to that man was a young man in brocade clothes, holding a folding fan in his hand, looking very coquettish. As the two walked, they exchanged words with each other. Xianjing showed a helpless expression from time to time, but he was still talking to the man. It seemed that the two of them knew each other well. Coincidentally, Xieting Zhou and the young master in brocade were also familiar with each other. If not Li Jiafeng, who were they looking for? I checked during the time you were gone. Li Jiafeng used a folding fan to separate pedestrians approaching Xianjing from time to time. Your name means emptiness. Since you are emptiness, junior brother, and I are also emptiness, so why don't we two get together, so that everyone is not empty? Xianjing said coldly. Xianjing is nothingness, not emptiness. Before Tai Su, it was quiet and pure. Refined Li Jiafeng brushed his hair. It's almost the same thing. I have given up my past fame and fortune, that is, I have also given up my amazing talents and rich knowledge. Now, I am just an ordinary person. Ordinary people, you don't have to look down on me, but my parents don't dare to regret it because of my handsome appearance. Xianjing stopped and stared at Li Jiafeng for a long time. He opened his lips several times, but finally said nothing and turned to leave. Senior brother, don't leave. Li Jiafeng followed. You haven't become a monk yet, so we can't be considered brothers. Master has already promised me to lead my training, senior brother. Senior brother. Pedestrians were rubbing shoulders with each other, and Li Jiafeng was squeezed away before he could keep up. Turning his head, the person was startled. Hey, isn't this my stingy brother I haven't seen in a few years? Warm reminder, if you find that clicking the next page will force you to jump to other websites, please use the chapter error or contact us at the bottom to inform us. We will handle it as soon as possible. Thank you for your understanding. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 309. Yongquanlinhai is the largest port today. You can reach Linyan Island in 2 hours at sea. Li Jiafeng really couldn't bear the hardship of the temple, so he bought a house in Yongquan. In order to show his determination to escape into Buddhism, there was not a single maid in the house, but only men. How is it? Is it okay here? Li Jiafeng asked. Xieting Zhou stood in the pavilion, twisted some fish food and sprinkled it, and the koi in the water immediately rolled over to grab food. Are you ready to settle down here? Li Jiafeng sat on the railing and crossed his legs. Let's see. It depends on what my senior brother says. If he wants to travel around the world, I will change places with him. Xieting Zhou looked at Li Jiafeng with a deep look. Why are you looking at me like this? Li Jiafeng asked. Xieting Zhou said nothing. Li Jiafeng crossed his arms and said, I hope you can control yourself. Now that I am determined to escape into Buddhism, even brothers cannot be too presumptuous. Li Jiafeng glanced sideways at Xieting Zhou. Don't look at me like that, I'm still a young man after all. Do you want face? Xieting Zhou had the urge to leave Yongquan immediately. This place has Li Jiafeng, who has a face thicker than the city wall, which will make him never want to set foot here again in his life. Are you possessed by something dirty? The master is at home, let him exorcise you. Li Jiafeng smiled and said, I can't help it. The imperial power has restricted me. The person I am now is the real me. Can Xianjing stand you? Xieting Zhou asked. Li Jifeng shook his sleeves and said, my senior brother is an expert, so his endurance is naturally incomparable to others. Are you really ready to escape into Buddhism? Xieting Zhou looked at Li Jifeng's neatly tied hair. Are you going to escape into Buddhism to see the Buddha or someone else? Li Jifeng looked around. How did you tell? Unfortunately, Xieting Zhou said slowly, I am your stingy and cheap brother, and I know you a little bit. Li Jifeng was worried that no one would talk to him about his worries. Xieting Zhou happened to be here, but he couldn't have a long conversation. He moved forward and said cautiously, I think, something is wrong with me. Xieting Zhou glanced behind Li Jifeng, his movements were quick and fleeting, and a smile appeared on his lips. If Li Jifeng looked carefully, he would definitely be able to find that his dear brother must have some evil intentions, but he was immersed in his own world at the moment. Where to start? Li Jifeng thought for a while and said, I'm very conflicted. Xieting Zhou replied lightly to show that he was listening. Li Jifeng had a solemn look on his face and knocked on the folding fan in his hand. Logically speaking, if I become a monk and become a monk, wouldn't I be closer to my senior brother? But I don't think so. Oh, Xieting Zhou said, do you think it would be better to pull your senior brother out of hiding? Li Jifeng had an expression on his face that said, he is indeed my brother. But he changed the subject and said, but, I feel like a brother. I remember someone said something to me. Xieting Zhou said slowly, if love lasts forever, it will not be between a male and a female. These words are now given to you intact. Li Jifeng pointed at Xieting Zhou, don't talk nonsense, we are monks. Monks don't lie. Xieting Zhou pointed his finger to the sky, Buddha can see it, so you can think of something before you speak. Li Jifeng was still a little in awe of the Buddha, and he suddenly lost his temper and said, I'm done. I look at my senior brother now more beautiful than any other girl. Xieting Zhou smiled. Just as Li Jifeng was about to speak, he suddenly heard the sound of something breaking behind him. Looking back, I saw a pot of orchids knocked over on the ground, and a white figure running away in the corridor in the distance. Li Jifeng watched blankly as the figure disappeared behind the arch. When he turned to look at Xieting Zhou again, he felt that his neck was rusty. You are truly my brother. No thanks, Xieting Zhou said quietly, instead of seeing you wasting time, I might as well give you a push. Your senior brother is an extraordinary person. I'm afraid he has already noticed the clues, but he has never pointed it out to you. Li Jifeng felt happy when he heard it. Does that mean he knew it well and didn't reject it directly, so there was hope? Xieting Zhou picked up the handkerchief and wiped his hands, then turned around and poured cold water on Li Jifeng. It's also possible that I don't want to break up with you. The smile on Li Jifeng's face had not yet bloomed, but it was stuck on his face. He stood up, straightened his robe and chased out, not forgetting to turn back and point at Xieting Zhou. Bad friend. Then he chased Xianjing. Xieting Zhou stood there with a smile and saw Shen Yu walking towards him. What did you do? Xieting Zhou picked her up and said, I have fallen in love with Li Jifeng's house and I just thought of a way to trick him away. Let's live here for a while. Good. The year Xieting Zhou got his wish of a girl who could be married to a little girl, he received a letter from Li Jifeng, saying that his senior brother was too difficult to deal with. Xieting Zhou took the letter and studied the sentence with Shen Yu for a long time. Difficult means that it is difficult to get it done or not. This question will become a mystery in the next year. The year when little Jeju could walk, they took the child to Ling'an again. Xuanan is over 3 years old and looks very lovable. The only thing he doesn't look good towards is Xieting Zhou. He calls him by his first name, including Xie Yun, and refuses to call him godfather. Asked why he didn't like Xieting Zhou, he was so stupid that he couldn't explain it. When little Jeju was 7 years old, Li Jifeng asked someone to send him a portrait. The painting shows two good-looking men. One holds a fan in his hand and smiles proudly. The other smiles very lightly. He is still holding a string of Buddhist beads in his hand, but his black hair has grown to his waist. In his long life, he left only a few strokes in the history books. In the 19th year of Tongxu's reign, Prince Yetingzhou of the north and Princess Shenyu of the north worked together to drive away foreign enemies and eliminate internal troubles. In the first year of Yongning, Emperor Yongning ordered Chan to be located in Bailan King Xiayun. However, Bailan King did not ascend the throne and took charge of the government for the next 4 years. Later, it was passed to Emperor Jianing. In the 27th year of Jianing, Emperor Jianing passed away to Emperor Yuanjia. In the 21st year of Yuanjia, King Bailan and his princess passed away in their sleep and were buried together in Yanliang Pass. Their story begins here and ends here, and they must protect this homeland for all their lives.